Ancient Egypt has always attracted magicians. From the Hermetics to the Gnostics to Aleister Crowley, magicians have found the ancient gods and practices of Egypt compelling. Let's take a look at ancient Egypt's most famous magical text, the Book of the Dead. Hey folks, this is James, aka Thresciornis, here to talk to you about the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. Now these documents were known in medieval Europe, but no one could translate them, and so they remained largely a mystery. It was in 1842 that a German Egyptologist named Karl Richard Lepsius first called this collection of documents the Book of the Dead. And the name stuck. The famous Egyptologist E.A. Wallace Budge used that name for his translation, but most scholars now agree that the real translation is something more like the Book of Going Forth by Day or the Book of Emerging Forth into the Light, which spoke more of the true nature of the book as not just funerary preparation, but true transformation into the afterlife. We'll stick with the popular title, The Book of the Dead, as it's the one most often used by publishers. But the important thing to remember is that it's not just one single book. It's sort of a genre of literature, of spiritual literature that evolved over time. In fact, they started with what scholars call the pyramid texts, and these were engravings on the walls of pyramids. They were reserved exclusively for the pharaoh and sometimes for their wives. It wasn't until the first intermediary period, that time between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom when power was decentralized, that these writings started showing up on coffins of wealthy individuals, anyone who can afford to have them made. It isn't until the New Kingdom that we start to find scrolls. These were commissioned by those who could afford them from certain priest scribes, and it was actually quite an industry, and we found scrolls that have blank spaces where the names of the purchaser can be inserted so that the scrolls could be made in short order. The most famous version is called the Papyrus of Ani, a scroll made for a fellow scribe named Ani. It is a most strikingly beautiful and complete version of the Book of the Dead. It was stolen from Egypt by the aforementioned Wallace Budge and secreted away to the British Museum, where it hangs to this day and remains one of their most popular attractions. Though all versions of the Book of the Dead contain instructions for preservation and mummification, the bulk of the text is made up of spells and instructions that will help a soul overcome various obstacles that they would have before they reach their final destination in the afterlife. Now, in the pyramid text, this would mean the pharaoh joining the court of Ra in a solar-oriented afterlife. But when we get to the coffin texts, the focus changes to meeting Osiris in a chthonic underworld called the Duat. And the Duat is a place filled with demons and gods. Some of the gods keep mansions there, and through most of ancient Egyptian history, Osiris is considered the pharaoh of the Duat. The Book of the Dead is full of incantations to be spoken by the deceased to overcome their obstacles, but it's also a guidebook to the Duat, explaining its denizens in many locations. One thing that features heavily in every Book of the Dead is a scene called the Weighing of the Heart, and it's here that the newly deceased will face Osiris, Anubis, Thoth, and the demoness Amut, and a host of other gods to be judged. Here the deceased will make what's called the negative confessions, a list of misdeeds that they did not commit in life. Lying won't help you here, because in the end, every supplicant undergoes what's called the weighing of the heart, where the heart of the deceased is taken, filled with the weight of their misdeeds, and is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. Now, Ma'at is an extremely complex concept in Egyptian mythology. Hopefully we'll get to make a video on that sometime. But in the end, if the feather weighs more than the heart, Thoth records the judgment, and the soul can move on to the field of reeds. However, if the heart weighs more than the feather, then the deceased is thrown into the jaws of a mutt. And in some versions of the tale, that means total oblivion. A terrifying concept for a lot of Egyptians, who went through great pains to ensure that they would be remembered to future generations and receive the offerings necessary to guarantee their continued existence in the afterlife. In a general sense, the ancient Egyptians believed that the afterlife would be pretty much the same as living in this world. You'd have to grow food and labor. But don't worry, the Book of the Dead gives you some solutions here. In the creation of what's called shabti, and these are small idols. They can be made out of any material, but the ones I find most striking are made of Egyptian blue faience, a type of glazed pottery. The shabti can be made into all forms of servants, farmers, cooks, and scribes, and they would do all the manual labor for you as you kicked back in the afterlife. It's very much like the modern magical concept of servitors. And this brings me to my personal take on the almost obsessive nature of Egyptian funerary practices. If the afterlife is pretty much the same as this life, then you already know what the most successful survival strategy is. Be born rich. And that seems to be the focus of this, to be born wealthy into the afterlife. And of course, this is something that the rich themselves were obsessed with. In the end, what is the Book of the Dead worth to us as magicians? Well, first, it's an in-depth view of ancient Egyptian cosmology, and in it you'll meet all sorts of spirits and gods. You'll learn about the nature of the underworld and have a map of the underworld itself. My advice is to treat the Book of the Dead as you would a grimoire in the Goetic tradition, because that's kind of what it is. Goetia is so much more than just a handful of medieval books based on Solomonic magic. It's an ancient tradition, goes back to ancient Greece, and it's the practice of the Goes, people who were hired to wail at funerals, acting as psychopomps, shepherding the spirits of the dead into the underworld. They were also proficient necromancers and often hired to speak with spirits of the dead. And it's through this knowledge of the dead that they became allies with the spirits of the underworld. And that's how this tradition started. And you can see that although the Book of the Dead obviously is not Greek, it is perhaps a precursor to this tradition. When looked at from this perspective, it's just like many of the grimoires, a necromantic manual that concerns itself with spirits of the underworld. And in the Book of the Dead, you're going to find instructions to make amulets and spells that will be just as useful for a living magician as they would be for a dead one. But once again, I'm getting ahead of myself. A video on the tradition of Goetia itself is long overdue. But before we go, I feel I owe you at least one quote from the Book of the Dead itself, this from the Papyrus of Ani, and it's one of my favorite passages. Grant, O might of Thoth, that which the god Atum hath decreed. And thou regardest not evil, nor art thou provoked to anger when they bring their years to confusion, and throng in, and push to disturb their months. For in all that they have done unto thee, They have worked iniquity in secret. I am thy writing pallet, O Thoth, and I have brought unto thee thine ink jar. I am not of those who work iniquity in their secret places. Let not evil happen unto me. Well, I hope you really liked that one, and I hope you can imagine what great content we can bring you after visiting Egypt in person. We're going in November, and I can really use your help in buying camera equipment and having money to pay for the permits that are required to film in the ancient sites. Please go to our Ko-Fi page where you can donate for that. You could also, of course, buy yourself a little something on our Redbubble store. We've got t-shirts with the Scroll of Thoth logo and some other designs that I think you'll enjoy. Thank you again for watching. We'll see you next time.